So we're going to move on to our next presentation, and I'd really like now to welcome Sue Pritchard. I also want to apologise because we got Sue's affiliation wrong in the timetable we circulated. Sue is the Chief Executive for the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. And Sue, very big welcome. Thank you. You're going to talk to us about, in the big debates about land use, whose voices counts. So please, over to you.
It's a real pleasure to be here today. As you say, I'm Chief Executive of the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. I'm also a Welsh farmer, so I have been listening with interest to some of the earlier presentations with a very different stakeholder hat on. So I might be coming back to some of this. I had questions myself to ask, but I avoided that opportunity. So the Food Farming Countryside Commission was set up over 2 years ago now, 3 years ago in fact, in 2017, by a cross-sector group of business, NGO and other leaders, initially in response to the Brexit vote, when those folk understood, perhaps not even enough back then, just how significant that Brexit vote was going to be for the future of food and farming and the countryside, and wanted to work together to help support government, business and civic society to both understand and plan for the changes ahead. It's funded by Esme Fairbairn Foundation and chaired by Serene Cheshire, along with 14 other commissioners who are drawn from food and farming businesses, from green and environment businesses, academics, public health professionals. So the commission itself reflects actually some of the points that earlier speakers have already made, the multiple interests that have a stake in the issues that we're talking about here. The mandate for the Commission was to engage more voices, perhaps the unusual suspects, people who ordinarily don't have a voice, in helping to shape a new vision for a post-Brexit future for food and farming, for rural affairs, rural communities, rural economies, the countryside, and also responding to the triple emergencies in climate, in nature, and indeed in health and well-being, and thinking about how we can work towards a fair and just transition to the kinds of economies, the kind of societies we need with that context. So we published our reports back in July last year. God, it feels like a million years ago now. If you want to have a look at them, they are up on our website in the library section at fscc.co.uk. Our reports went down very well, I'm pleased to say. We got cross-party, cross-professional, cross-sector backing for our recommendations. And so that was an enormous relief and also a great privilege, actually, to have been able to have done the work to find common ground for so many different interests and sectors. And as a result of that, our funders asked us to think about whether there might be a continuing role for us. And we did a whole bunch of stakeholder inquiry over the winter last year and put in a bid to our funders. And since April this year, we've been an independent charitable organisation where we've set ourselves up in the context of the coronavirus crisis, which I'll make mention of as we go through. But essentially, our mission from here on is about convening conversations and leadership across business, across government, across civic society, NGOs in communities on the really difficult issues. And of course, to help implement our recommendations, the ones that we're focusing most on at the moment are a land use framework for England particularly, although it does have relationships with the other devolved nations, on the transition to agroecology by 2030, and of course the farming transition that the whole of the farming communities working through at the moment in the post-Brexit, post-CAP scenarios. We are working, we're working quite hard on developing a national agroecology development bank in order to put the right resources behind that transition. And we're also spending quite a bit of time working with our own country and county inquiries and other communities to understand a bit more about what it means to resource more resilient and adaptable communities. Now, when we wrote our bid at Christmas, coronavirus had not really raised its head across the whole of the UK. We had yet to fully understand the implications, although of course we were starting to hear stories coming out of China. But as luck would have it, and I say that with big quotation marks around it, our mission and our purpose and what we're funded to do actually works very well in this new with corona world, as you can see. So one of the big issues that we are dealing with at the moment is what work looks like, what the rural economy might look like in a corona adapted world, and what food security might look like in a corona adapted world. And we'll go on to talk about that as I whiz through. So what I'm going to do today is, having watched with great interest and indeed awe at the previous presenters, really detailed plans, models, and approaches, I'm going to tell you some stories. Part of our mission and purpose is in engaging different voices is to share those stories, to amplify those stories, illuminate the stories that come from around the UK, that add some depth and detail and richness to the data that can otherwise feel a little bit dry and a little bit abstracted and a little bit distant from people's everyday concerns and questions, how we actually talk about things in our everyday lives. So I'm going to tell some stories from the different perspectives that we've been engaging in over the last couple of years and continue to work with. So let's start with farmers and growers. So as colleagues earlier have pointed to, we are in an incredibly critical time for farmers and growers in the UK. First of all, in working through the post-Brexit settlement and what that could look like, how that can be designed to meet the needs of the UK, but also how it helps farmers and growers transition from a farming system that they have been encouraged to adopt through multiple policy mechanisms over the last 70 years to the one that we know we need now. Now, in England, ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, in a sense does what it says on the tin. It signals that public money, public investment needs to be directed very clearly to environmental gains. But of course, as compelling as that simple narrative is, the devil, to use this particular cliche, is of course in all of the detail. People sometimes say to me, so what do farmers think? Farming is an enormously diverse and multifaceted sector. I'm an organic permaculture farmer in the Welsh countryside, farming for conservation and farming with livestock. My farming business, my orientation, the things I do are very, very, very different to colleagues in, let's say, the east of England, who are focused on big arable businesses, perhaps producing one or two crops for a global agri-food sector. And then, of course, there are other really critical parts of the sector that don't even fall into the plans. One of the, this is particularly pertinent in Wales at the moment because I'm sitting on the First Minister's Green Recovery Task Force, and we are looking with great interest at some of the proposals that are coming from communities to respond to the economic challenges in the post-corona world, but also ensure that we're on the right track for green recovery in Wales. And we've been having a lot of representations, very welcome representations, from young and new entrants into farming, but people who are particularly focused on horticulture. So whilst ELMS and other schemes are focusing on the environmental aspects of large-scale land management, there are also really big questions that we need to explore with farmers and growers about what it is that we grow, where we grow it, and how we grow it in order to feed us, how we take responsibility for ourselves as a country to feed ourselves the kind of fresh fruit, vegetables that we need. Horticulture is currently outside of current land schemes. So, you know, small, I'll drop this in quickly for my Welsh colleague on the call. Strong representation coming through from small scale enterprises under 5 hectares or 10 acres who fall out of the permitted development rules, so that they find it incredibly difficult to invest in the infrastructure that they need, things like polytunnels, things like packing and washing facilities, because they are subject to really difficult planning requirements, because they're not considered to be, if you like, proper businesses, even though a small horticulture business on even 5 acres can actually be a really, really substantial business. So that's one little example of some of the kind of complexity. So let's go on to talk about what is it that citizens are talking about? What do citizens want? Let's follow that line of argument around what we grow, where we grow it. In our Learning from Lockdown survey over the last few months, it's clear that people have started to think differently about their food and where it comes from. We saw in the early stages the real challenges to the supermarket supply chains in getting the sorts of food we wanted on shelves. Well, that kind of resolved itself. But we know from our research that there's a really interesting story to tell about where people are choosing to go to buy their food, where they wanted to buy it from, who they wanted to buy it from, and the way in which small farmers and local producers have changed their relationship with their communities and their local consumers to provide fresh fruit and vegetables, healthy fruit and veg, direct to customers through box schemes. There's been a huge growth in the rise of box schemes. Now, for that change in policy to really support and facilitate local food businesses, shorter supply chains, requires, again, the intersection of policy questions, not just from DEFRA, but from BEIS. How do local enterprise partnerships and other groups invest in those sorts of businesses to support local supply chains? And then the other thing that citizens tell us that they really want to have more of is easy access to the countryside. For those of us who aren't living on farms in the middle of nowhere, and I won't show you what it looks like outside of my window, it's a particularly lovely sunny day. I think those of us who live in the countryside have realised how very privileged we are to have access to green spaces. For many people in the country, access to green space is much more complicated. We have a built environment that has not been designed with that in mind. And it is really difficult for some people to get out into the countryside through changes in transport policy. It's often very difficult to get on public transport, to get from the city into the countryside, to be in nature, which we know, we knew before, we know even more now, is really, really important for people's health and well-being. So let's talk a bit more now about communities and places. When we were conducting our own research in the last couple of years, particularly around the notion of a land use framework for England, several councils and communities shared with us their frustrations about the extent to which existing planning guidelines support sustainable practices. So, for example, we heard from North Norfolk Council, where 40% of housing in North Norfolk is actually second homes, and how incredibly difficult it is to invest in affordable housing for young people or people who want to stay in their communities, who are often doing those really important jobs that communities rely on so much for a kind of rich and vibrant life. That, the people who are the teachers, the nursery nurses, healthcare workers, people who will work on highways and roads, all the kind of social infrastructure jobs that are frankly very often underpaid. And if you're working in that kind of job or that kind of sector, it becomes increasingly difficult to find places to live, affordable places to live in some parts of our communities. So there are big questions when we talk about land use. There are big questions about how we make choices about how we use that land. And another little example that came up was from a tractor driver on a farm who said, you know, it's great to see people coming into the countryside, but when they're commuting 2 or 3 hours a day to get to their jobs in London, nobody's willing to coach the football team at the end of the day. And it means our village life, our community life is depleted as a result. Now, interestingly, living through the coronavirus crisis, we are all realizing very quickly that life does not necessarily need to be like that. And so we're asking ourselves fresh questions about what a vibrant community really needs. Where is the green space within our urban environments? Where is the access to green space for urban citizens? But how can rural communities become more vibrant and more economically viable if, as it turns out, people can in fact live and work anywhere and do their work? So let's also now have a think about the voices of business and industry. So we know at the moment the policy direction of travel is characterized by slogans like, you know, build, 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 and build back better, and, you know, let's invest in infrastructure for a green recovery. But again, there are some really important questions to ask about where that investment happens and whose voices count. Now, a couple of anecdotes that I like to share because I still find them really quite shocking. In the challenge to build back better, and, you know, picking up on the need for affordable homes, that is also replete with complexity and political choices. Many of you will probably know better than I do that in the Help to Buy policy environment of a couple of years ago, many house builders trousered, frankly, enormous profits on the back of that policy intervention. And at present, the research seems to tell us that it had no beneficial impact for first-time buyers and their ability to access affordable housing. And so that takes me to the question of how the language that we use when we talk about investment in business, and back to farming, what we call investment and what we call subsidy. So when we talk about farming, we often talk about the subsidies that farmers get through the Common Agricultural Policy and whether it's an appropriate use of public money. But when we talk about other sectors like rail or housing or energy, other infrastructure sectors, we call public money payments their investment. Now, that's a really important signal about what we think is important and where we want to direct public money. Personally, I would very much like us to start talking about investing in a much more sustainable food and farming system, rather than carrying on colluding with that language that talks about subsidising individual farmers. And then, of course, there are big questions about who speaks for the non-human world. Now, in the UK, this often gets characterised as the very contested, really quite toxic debate sometimes about wilding, rewilding, and other uses of land. You know, how can we ensure that nature's voice and nature recovery is equally prioritised? Now, at present, that often does get characterised as an either-or polarising argument. There's another, forgive me for using a lot of Welsh stories, but I'm particularly close to those. There's a really, really important project down in West Wales called From Summit to Sea that's currently on hold, where the debates between the advocates for rewilding those spaces, and the farming and other communities that already resided there became so toxic that the project ended up being postponed. Now, those issues, the issues that needed to be addressed, how we improve biodiversity and the richness of nature in some of the Welsh uplands, how we support those rural communities to be able to continue to make a reasonable livelihood from their efforts. All of those big arguments have not gone away, but the way in which we fold in the concerns and the needs of the non-human world is currently really, really complicated. And not to forget the issues that other countries are facing. Now, trade conversations are really, really starting to hot up as we run down the clock to the end of the transition period and our new trading relationships with the rest of the world. The sorts of decisions we make about land use in this country are inevitably deeply, deeply connected and implicated in what happens in countries elsewhere. Do we choose to take more responsibility, for example, for our food and food production in the UK, or do we risk offshoring our climate impacts in buying food and other products from countries who have a different commitment to climate and nature? What does that mean for our shared commitment and our role as UK leaders and as signatories to things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which are, let's face it, one of the few sets of international obligations that the world has managed to find some consensus for, at least until recently? And what is the role of global businesses in helping to shape national policy about how land is used? Global agribusinesses at present, I would argue, have at the moment an unequal voice, too strong a voice in determining how land is used, how countries choose to develop their land, particularly in food production. And there has been a trend towards monoculture productions in countries which make them particularly reliant on certain types of supply chains. And finally, who speaks for future generations? Lots of the decisions we make now have huge, significant long-term implications, which for many of us, and I include myself in this, are not going to be, we're not going to have to live through those. We are making decisions now on how we use our land, how we respond to the climate emergency and the nature emergency that will have huge impact on future generations. Who speaks for those in these debates? When we conduct our stakeholder meetings in slightly grim hotels on the edge of towns at 7 o'clock on a wet November evening, people are really reluctant to participate in those processes, and certainly we do not hear from young people in those sorts of debates. So let's get to what we've done at the Food Farming Countryside Commission. How have we sought to resolve and explore some of the really tricky questions that I've posed in the story and the narrative I've described to you there? So when we were describing our own research processes back in 2017-18, we were, and knowing that our mandate was to bring in wider voices, we were particularly attracted by a way of working called critical systems heuristics. And it's the most unattractive title, isn't it, that you can possibly imagine. But actually, it's an incredibly practical and straightforward approach that provides a process through which we can respond to the questions that we raise. So essentially, critical systems heuristics integrate critical theory, systems thinking, and heuristic methods. Critical theory is about reflecting analysing society and how power works in society. It's also not just observing it, but also taking some responsibility for changing society. Systems thinking, colleagues earlier have talked about, systems thinking sees the world as interrelated, interdependent, emergent, adaptive, and also, I think, helps us see spaces, not just the things. So just reflecting on those incredibly busy and detailed maps that Pam showed us earlier. In systems thinking, we pay as much attention to the relationships between those things as we do to the things themselves. And that last word, heuristics are essentially a very practical approach to problem solving. What can we do here? How can we take action? How can we get on and make a difference right now? Making sure that, and to paraphrase Michael Gove in his time as Secretary of State for DEFRA, how can we make sure that the perfect is not the enemy of the good, so that we can get on and do what is needed to make pacey progress in some really, really critical issues. So essentially, it's a systems approach that is about encountering inequity and unfairness by ensuring that all those affected by decisions have a role in making them. And so the sorts of questions then that we ask ourselves look something like this. First of all, we think, who are we including in this system? Whose information is folded in and who is folded out? Now, a phrase I use quite often, particularly on bad-tempered Twitter debates, which kind of call in the science in, to back up arguments. The science, I hope you can see me doing my little inverted commas here, quotation marks, that the science can only ever answer the questions that we ask of it. And the process of scientific inquiry is always deeply implicated in the mindsets and assumptions, the taken for granted mindsets and assumptions that are replete throughout society, how we think about things. Now, good scientists know that, absolutely, but in the public understanding of science, sometimes we ascribe too much objectivity, too much certainty to scientific methods. So in referencing boundary critique and thinking about who we include in our definition of the system, we can ask ourselves that question: whose science are we bringing in? Are we bringing in the geographer? Are we bringing in the economist? Are we bringing in the social scientist, the psychologist? Whose information, whose theoretical backstory are we inviting into this debate to help us in our deliberations? Who's involved in making those choices and who decides? And then we can ask some questions about who in fact carries the risk and who reaps the benefit. And then of course we can come back to asking those questions. What value judgments are in play, explicitly or indeed implicitly, when we talk about a fair and just transition to a future society, a future economy that helps to restore nature, that mitigates and reverses climate change, and that enables everyone in society now and in future generations to live healthy and flourishing lives. What's the data we count? So I'm going to stop there because time is racing on, and it'd be great to hear some responses and some questions. And you can get in touch with me for more chat in those methods.
Thank you so much, Sue. Really, really interesting, rich stories, and I think you just hit on something that we saw as a big gap in the 2019 programme, in that we really didn't have the social sciences in the room, so we were ignoring all of those human processes, all those social interactions, all the different actors in some of the science discussions that we were having, and that's what we're hoping to really push forwards in the next couple of days in the workshop. So that's really, really useful background for us. We do have a couple of quick questions on Slido. One of them talks about how contentions between a desire to produce better quality food less intensively at smaller scales and the challenge of food poverty, as indicated by the 1.5 million people using food banks in the UK in 2019, be resolved.
And that's a brilliant question, and it's a question that we are going to be spending a lot of time exploring over the next few years, because we do make big assumptions, don't we, about the nature of affordability and the sorts of policy instruments we should use to make sure food stays cheap. So around this question are also questions of true cost accounting. So to what extent does the food currently on our plate absorb and reflect its cost of production, both to the environment and indeed to human health? So at the moment, it would be true to say that the cheap food on our plate has huge cost to environments in its production, in terms of the pesticides and synthetic chemicals that are used in its production, in terms of the land that is cleared for its production, in terms of the climate impact of its production. And it also has impact on human health. There's a massive rise in diet-related ill health right now. As we know, type 2 diabetes is rising exponentially. It costs the NHS £12 billion and then a further £13 billion on days lost, on productive days lost to the economy. So the first question is, to what extent does food currently reflect its true cost of production? And when it doesn't, who's also paying that cost? And of course, it's taxpayers who pay that cost. The businesses who produce cheap junk food, over-processed food, ultra-processed food, are some of the most profitable businesses in the world, and they are not absorbing the cost of that production. And we're also paying it through the cost to the NHS. But meanwhile, it is absolutely the case that our current food system, in the sixth biggest economy in the world, sees millions of people food insecure or food poor. I don't really like that phrase. We talk about food poverty. It's just poverty, isn't it? When people can't afford to buy the healthy, nutritious food they need, whether because they don't have enough money or because they can't find it in their communities, then that's a real indictment of a democratic country. So these are big questions, and they need to be addressed through many policy levers. There's one strategy which feels perhaps more available to us than ever, is about taking food out of the monetary system altogether. So if food is easily available right now, if I look out in my garden, I cannot eat all of the food that has just been growing like topsy in my garden. And not everybody has the opportunity to grow their own food. But if we were guerrilla gardening in every space that we could find in towns and cities, if every green space had food growing in it, and that was freely available for anybody that needed it, that changes our relationship, doesn't it, with the monetary value that's placed on food and the food system.
Okay, lots to think of again. Just a really quick one again, because I'm aware we're running over.
Sorry.
But there's a question on basically how you and the stakeholders you work with plan for changing climate, and particularly in both the short term and the longer term.
Yeah. So I mean, there's lots I could say about the policy space, actually, but I won't, because other people have already done that. But just assume that we are also working in the policy space. But perhaps the area that I am most attracted to at the moment is how we work with communities. The coronavirus crisis demonstrated for us how place really matters, where we live really matters, who we see out of our front door actually matters to us, and how we connect to that community, how communities support and resource each other in times of crisis. And I'm really, really interested in working now from the ground up, as well as at the big national and international policy space, to understand what do communities need to become more resilient and more adaptable to face the multiple scenarios that we know may be in front of us, both for climate and for the depletion of nature. And that requires, I often call it just barefoot work. It doesn't require complex models. It doesn't require sophisticated consultation techniques, actually. It requires a different order of engagement about participating in our communities, joining in with our communities, the sorts of up-the-pub conversations where we can talk in really simple and straightforward ways about what matters to us and how we want to prepare for the futures that are in front of us. So that's the kind of work that I'm really interested in at the moment, as the kind of bookend to the big global and national policy conversations that are happening, but just deeply rooted in communities so we can all understand what we need to do for the future.
Great, thanks very much, Sue. Nice way to end. Thank you again for your presentation and for the issues you've raised.